Hello, everybody watching. Welcome to part 5 of our summer Heroes of the Faith series. My name's Pastor Callum. It's great to be with you all. And yeah, we're going to dive into today's character, Moses. Moses, very big hero of the faith, well known. He had a long life, the Exodus, the burning bush, many aspects that people have learnt about over the years. And he has 3 main sections to his life, each of about 40 years. You'll see he has the 0 to 40, where he kind of lives in Egypt. He has around 40 to 80, where he lives in Midian, and then the 80 to 120 of the Exodus, living in the wilderness. So this is the rough character of the Moses that we're going to be studying together today. So I hope you're ready. Get your Bibles or notepads, and we're going to spend some time really going into the text. We're going to start right at the beginning in Exodus 1. But before that, let's learn a bit of context about the situation. It's always good to take a step back when we evaluate one of these characters and know what is the situation that they step into. As with each character, the plot that's laid out before them really sets the scene and lays very key details for the story to come. And here we come to the Exodus. And this is obviously off the back of Genesis. It's a continuation of the story. And the very beginning of the text shows that. This is the end of Joseph. The family lives in Egypt. They've gone in with 70, a very metaphorical number. And now they're living in Egypt. And when it comes to the Exodus, we have 2 main camps in scholarly over when people actually think the Exodus was. There are 2 dates. You'll see there's the 2070 with Ramesses II, or the 1446 with, I think it's Menasophat, a earlier age pharaoh. So there are 2 rough dated dates. I actually did a paper on this, and it's very fascinating, lots of details, but obviously there are a lot of question marks regarding time, chronology, Egypt history, so there's a lot of detail that you can go into when studying this topic. But I personally hold to the 1446 date, mainly because it's a post-Hyksos people time. We see there's the collapse of the Egyptian military strength in the region around that time, as we see in the story, and there is just a lot of parallels. Although archaeologically there are some lackings, but I personally put that down to more of our misunderstanding of the chronology of Egyptian history. And there's a lot you can go into with that. However, you could also take a look, if you want to go into more detail, Michael Heiser's Naked Bible Podcast, episode 256, deals with this topic of the early in the date, and a lot of the details. You can look at the podcast around 2. He always talks about it. He gives a great, detailed, and well-documented, I wouldn't say too concise, it is pretty concise, but it is still a couple of hours over the many podcasts, but the single podcast on it is about an hour. You can really go into understanding what is the debate over the dating of the Exodus. So please feel free to study that. So we are now coming into this idea of Egypt. Egypt in the Exodus is the most powerful nation. It's one of the most powerful nations on earth, if not the most powerful nation on earth. It's in this area of dominance. There's a lot of famine, as we saw in the story of Joseph, where there's been a lot of, it's the end of the dominance of the pre-Babylonian empires, the 3rd dynasty of the Assyrians. They're still not at that power. The Hittites of the north in Turkey, they're still not that strong, or they are strong, but they're not as strong as Egypt. Egypt is the main power of this era, and it's portrayed in Scripture as well. Egypt is the new Babylon. It's portrayed as the climax of evil, the nation which is in its highest state of rebellion against God. And this whole detail is played out in this Pharaoh versus God dynamic. And we will see this come up time and time again. And obviously, within the Exodus, if you read the story, you see that Pharaoh is the one oppressing the Israelites. He's putting on punishment and punishment and punishment, and their God is blessing them, and they have part of this patriarchal covenant of blessing, and they are outnumbering the Egyptians, and the Egyptians are trying to cull their numbers through hard labor. And then we see this cruel and horrible thing of killing infants. So let's have a look into this story. So as we read this, we see that the king, or the Pharaoh, is asked for the Hebrew midwives to kill the babies. And so we read, then the king, so this is where we have a contrast of terms, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Sifra and the other Puah, when you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives to them and said, why have you done this? And let the male children live. The midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwives come to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong, and because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So we hear this very fascinating but very cruel and evil story. There's a lot of details in this beginning. But what we see is obviously the first detail is he's the king of Egypt, and then later called Pharaoh. So it's the same person, but the writer's using a variety of terms to kind of emphasize the king of Egypt, the ruler, Pharaoh. He is basically playing this arc battle type with God. You have God and his ways, and Pharaoh and his ways. And each have a people. Pharaoh has the Egyptians, his subjects, and God has the Israelites. And they're basically in this tussle, this wrestle of rebellion and struggle, and who is the dominant one. And then basically what happens is, it's a very interesting detail where Pharaoh tries to kill the children. And he's angry, and he's going to the midwives, why aren't you killing them? And it's very like, okay, how are they letting them live, and why is Pharaoh angry, but why is he not killing them for letting the kids live? So let's have a look at what's going on. We see at the very beginning where he says to the women, first of all, when you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. So this is the first command Pharaoh has for the ladies. The second command he has is, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So we see these two separate commands. The first is dealing with them on the birth stool, and the other one is dealing when they're born. And I believe, as scholars discuss this, I really agree with this idea that the first one is different from the second one. The first one is Pharaoh asking them to kill the kids, but while she is still pregnant. So on the birth stool, it's kind of like when the midwives would come and examine the mother pre-birth, as we saw, and they would have a look, and they would be on this birth stool. And this birth stool has a very interesting translation called the genitalia stones, because of their shape. And they are the place where the Hebrew women would squat on to give birth. But it's basically they would examine, they would then do some sort of ritual to find the gender, to determine the gender, and then they would be ready to proceed to give birth obviously over time. And I would say this kind of thing is the equivalent to a modern-day gynecologist visit. They come in, they get examined, they check that everything's okay, they find out the gender, and then they prepare you for birth, rather than them actually giving birth. I would argue this because if we read, when they give birth, Pharaoh's like, why have you let them live? He isn't saying, now kill them outside of the womb. He's saying, okay, they've been born, so therefore they're able to live. So basically what Pharaoh has requested of these ladies is to perform an abortion on every single male baby of the Hebrew women. So every woman who was a Hebrew woman in this first punishment time, when he asked them if they were pregnant with a boy, they were to abort the baby. And this is where God blesses the ladies for not obeying. So it's part of this. They don't obey, God gives them favor. And you see, this is the first step of war. This is the first transgression of Pharaoh, or the first personal transgression, where he's attacking life itself. Yes, he's oppressed the people, but this is the first time where he's really taking the idea of God into his own hands and saying, I want to control over who lives and who dies. I am in control of all the fetuses in the womb. And he is saying, no male Hebrew fetus deserves to live. It needs to be aborted. And this is where this evil is coming out. And it also makes sense of the passage. It makes sense because, as I said earlier, that once the baby was born, they weren't killed. And also their excuse of saying the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, before we get there, they've already given birth. So this check was pre-birth, by the time they get there, they've given birth. So I see this is right at the beginning of Exodus, this whole biblical foundation of why abortion is wrong. Why we see that it's this Egyptian kingdom that is creating this oppressive system, and part of it is this forceful abortion of babies. And it's almost like a genocide in a sense, or it's a selective killing, aimed to cull the numbers, to oppress the people. So Pharaoh is the one who is the god over life and death. So we see this whole evil, rebellious, anti-kingdom of God in this command. And so when it fails, Pharaoh increases the evil. Not only is killing a fetus wrong, but then he goes to saying, okay, they don't kill them as a fetus, fine, when they're born, I want them killed. So he goes on to say, now go he's not saying to the midwives, he says, then Pharaoh commanded all his people. So rather than using the midwives, he's now saying, my people, you all are going to commit these atrocities, and you are going to, as a nation, we are going to kill the Hebrew baby boys. And now this is the increasing of the evil. It starts with this abortion, and now it's increased to this killing of infants. And so these together are this increasing oppression on the Israelites. And this is the context of which Moses comes in. Is in this evil anti-God kingdom of Egypt, who is fighting God in as many evil ways as it can. And we see this portrayed in the acts of Pharaoh. So we have this context. Now we can read where Hebrews 11 comes in. And Hebrews 11, we see, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. So this Hebrews 11 is not only talking of Moses, it's talking of Moses' parents. And we see that this is laying a key theme for Moses' life. His parents, as we read in Exodus 2, verse 1 to 3, is, now a man from the house of Levi went and took a wife as a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bush reeds and daubed with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it amongst the reeds by the riverbank. So this is a Levi, house of Levi, and the parents, or the mother in this case, put the child in the basket and made it waterproof. And she hides him in that once he's 3 months old. But this is the faith of his mother or his parents, where they had to take this test. And there is a lot of detail to this story. There's a lot of, if you read this story a lot up in the internet, there is a lot of misinformation, where the Naked Bible Podcast episode 257 deals with the discussions over this story, where there are other ancient era stories that have similarities of kids being put into boxes on water. And there are a lot of misinformation where people try to say this story was copied, this story was taken from other texts, and frankly, this is not the case. This is a very weak argument, and when we look at the details, we see actually one of the closest stories that is categorically put in the same story as the Moses story is the Jesus story. So to try and portray it with other non-biblical stories, these similarities, they don't match up. And if you want to look more into this stuff, please go watch the Naked Bible podcast. So they hide Moses in the marsh, in a basket, waterproof. They put the bitumen pitch on to make it waterproof. And there's this principle that's at play. They put him in there because they value his life, because they see he's beautiful. They value his life, in contrast to the Pharaoh who does not value life. And that we also see this principle being at play, where we read in Peter, respect everyone and love the family of believers, fear God and respect the king. They feared God ultimate over Pharaoh's edict. This is the thing that they had to do. They had to choose where their loyalty would be. Would they respect the king's edict and would fear for him, or would they follow God and follow him? And there's this tension at play again. Is he either going to be loyal to Pharaoh or loyal to God? And the parents choose God. They keep the child, they hide him, and then they put him onto the water, and an act of faith, trusting that God will keep the child alive. And so we have these difficulties in our lives. As believers in God, we have the same test put in front of us. Are we going to choose loyalty to God, or are we going to choose loyalty to the anti-kingdom? Are we going to put our loyalty to Jesus, or are we going to put our loyalty into human things, or physical things, or into the systems of this world? And obviously we see right now in the world this whole issue of abortion. We have pro-life, you have a pro-abortion, you have all of these discussions, and they're very political, and I don't want to get into all of that, but it is what we can see. This whole element of abortion is where we as believers have to choose. Are we pro-life in a sense of we are pro-people living, pro-babies living, not the political movement, but the truth statement, the kingdom value? Or are we not pro-life, or are we pro-choice, or whatever other choice we are? Are we for the kingdom value, or are we not? And that is a test that we also as believers have to make today. And our actions in these crucial moments will determine where our loyalty lies. How we act determines more than what we say in where our loyalty is. And that's part of the faith of Moses' parents. They could have said whatever they like, but in the moment of choice, they chose to save Moses and to hold his value, God's values, over the Pharaoh's values. And as we read in the thing, they were not, from Hebrews 11, they were not afraid of the king's edict. They feared God, and more than they feared Pharaoh. They still respected and honored Pharaoh, knowing that they knew what the consequences were when they broke the rules. They broke the rules full knowing the consequence. And that's part of us as believers. When we do go against the kingdoms of the world, we do need to know that when we do so, we are accepting the responsibility of the repercussions. So, and we will see this later as Moses does also break the law later. But that's one thing to be encouraged in, knowing that when we follow God, we may sometimes have to go against the kings of the world. And we see from this story, God will be with us through the good and through the bad, and we need to trust him with the outcome, as his parents did when they put him in the basket. So obviously we then see in the story that the basket gets taken downstream, and lo and behold, it goes to who? The daughter of Pharaoh. The irony of the story, that the daughter of the king who was calling for the killing is the one who saves the one who is going to free his people. As the story is written intentionally with this irony, in the sense of God played this perfectly for a reason. And so Pharaoh's daughter pulls him out, names him Moses, and his sister turns up and says, let me find a nurse for the baby, and goes and finds Moses' mother. So they take the baby home, they nurse him, they nurture him to grow up, to the point that probably once he was of age 10 to 13 or maybe even younger, he would have gone back to Pharaoh's court and been Pharaoh's daughter. And so this is where we then see the next bit from Hebrews 11 crop up, and we read in verse 24, by faith, when Moses was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to reward. So here we have Moses. He has to make a choice. He's come into the scenario where he has grown up, he's of his own age, and now he's going, okay, I need to make a choice. And we read in the commentaries that this is a very interesting moment, because it says that when he grew up, when he'd grown up, points to a new development in the story of Moses. For he is in a position to exercise faith on his own behalf. And he does this by refusing to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And this the verb he refused is erinasado. And this badly pronounced Greek word by me points to a specific act or choice. It's a moment, it's a kairos moment. It's this moment of choice in crisis where Moses has come to this moment where he has to choose loyalty to God or loyalty to Pharaoh. And it's basically in this point where it could have had it's not premeditated, so it's not that he was saying, I'm going to choose to step out, act out. But rather, it was building in him. He knew he needed to make the decision, but that moment was the moment when he entered into this moment where he saw the Israelite being beaten by the Egyptian. He had to make the choice. That moment of crisis, a moment of choice, forced the decision to come out of him. So this idea does not imply absence of premeditation, but it does qualify the faith that it was a choice by faith. Like his parents, Moses now had to trust God with the outcome. As we read that it was basically by faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. So like his parents, he had to make a decision of loyalty to God or loyalty to Egypt. And that's part of this idea where he's going, I'm not afraid of the king's anger. I am more afraid of God. And that's this element of faith in the choice. Like his parents, when he was born, he chose on his own accord to trust God, to be willing to suffer, to be willing to lose the prestige of all he had, everything he'd been given for the sake of the kingdom. And so this was this element where he then killed an Egyptian. He fled Egypt. He did wrong. It's not to hide that the murder was wrong. And it's not to say by when he did this by faith that it justifies the murder. But what it does say is that, yes, he did commit a crime, and he was against the kingdom of Egypt. He trusted God with the outcome. He trusted God for providing safety. And we see, as from the story of Paul, this is an element where running from persecution is justified. We are allowed to flee the judgment of the world in some scenarios. Not by fear, but by faith. And that's a key one. We're not to flee persecution by fear. We only flee persecution when we're called by faith. And that comes back to the other principle where we still need to honor the king and be knowing that we are willing to take the full punishment of the act if God says so. That is to break the rule by faith, not by fear. It's respecting the authority when it does not clash with the things of God. So Moses escapes. He goes to Midian, and he learns basically the second area of his life. He learns their training of a new culture in Midian with a new language, a new family. He has a wife, he has a kid. And in this time, in this next lesson of leadership training that he gets as a shepherd, God comes and intervenes. And we read this in Moses' story in Exodus 3. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called out for him from the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So this story, as we read, is laid in Horeb. Horeb is used occasionally interchangeably with Sinai, and scholars would argue that this is the region of Horeb, and within that region you have Mount Sinai, and that is the mountain of God. So we're at Sinai, where Moses is called by God to lead his people out of Egypt. And it's the same place that they will return to post-Exodus or post-escape to come and receive the law. This was the place that they were to come back and worship God. It was the mountain of God. It was holy because it was God's place of dwelling, in a sense. It's holy because God was there. And we see this is another physical encounter with man and God, because Moses is one of these patriarchal leaders. And part of that qualification was to have a visitation with the angel of the Lord. And we see that he was in the midst of the bush, and he calls out, Moses, Moses. We see this frequently. Why twice? Well, in Hebrew, when you put two words together, you say, Moses, Moses. It means, my dearest Moses. There's a personal element. There's this personal attachment. Jesus says this, Eloi, Eloi. And it's this element, Father, Father, my dearest Father, why have you forsaken me? Or Abba, Father is the English way. It is basically to say when they repeat the word, it's this Hebrewism language that is used to imply this affection, this emotional attachment. So my dearest Moses. And then he lays out this whole idea of holiness. Take your sandals off, have respect for who I am, and know that I am your God. And Moses responds by taking his sandals, but he can't look at God. There is this reverent fear where he knows that God is, he can engage with God. He's not afraid to engage with God, but he still has reverent fear, knowing that because he can't look at him. So he's in relationship, but he can't still look directly at him as that part of that. He is holy. He is so pure that I cannot fully look at him and interact with him. And so that's this element of knowing that he is God, not my best buddy that I can hug. That's part of this element of holiness. And this first usage in Exodus lays out the theme of holiness to come. And these first usages, as it was previously used in the Shabbat, this is the second time, and it's part of this laying out the theme of what holiness really means. So Moses is called to go back into Egypt to free his people from the slavery in Egypt, and to take them where? To the promised land, as God is the God of their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's his family lineage theme coming back in. And God ensures that Moses has no excuses to try and wriggle himself out of this one. Beforehand, he's wriggled himself out of a lot of things. But this time, God's not letting him go. And Moses said to God as a response of this calling, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to them, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. In Dutch, Ben is the Ben, or in English, the I am, is this Yahweh, this Yahweh. Or it's this is the name of God being given to Moses. And God said, say this to the people, I am has sent you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. This is part of God being family with his people. He's their family God. He has relationship with the people. But then he gives them their name. And this is the first time we encounter it as readers. But how would they know it if Moses has asked for this as an account? Well, I would argue that the people already knew it, but this is the first time we learn about it as readers. And there's this whole scholarly stuff over this through the lineage of Cain. There's lots of details to go through. The Canaanites, I think it is, about knowing the name already. The name was already present and part of this attachment that the people already knew his name, but this was to affirm it in a sense. You go, or the other argument is that no, this is the first time. So there is a debate over this, but I would lean into the sense that for God to share his name is not the first time, rather the first time that we can perceive it. That there is an element that if God were to just say it and go, yeah, how would they know that that's his name? There needed to be already a familiarity to the name to attach Moses to their God as part of the calling, as part of the representation. So that would make more sense of the story. So this is where the Lord, God, attaches his name to the people formally, through Moses. And when you attach your name to people, when you give your name to people, it's basically giving them access to the power associated with the name. He is granting them the power to represent him, to have the authority of his name. And we see this displayed in the plagues. The plagues come, Moses and Aaron partake in enacting these plagues with the staff, which is his vessel of utilizing the power. And what is this staff? Well, this staff is part of Moses' lack of faith, where he goes, but behold, what if they will not believe me or listen to my voice? For they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. Then the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? He said, a staff. He said, throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent. Moses ran from it. The Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. So he put it out and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. That they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. So God not only provides him the name, Moses' still lack of faith means he needs a sign. And so that sign is this serpent staff, the power staff, the staff that God would use to enact his power through as like a vessel, in a sense, a mediator, not through the people always directly. So God provides this symbol of power. It's almost like a prophet. And this is part of Moses' prophetic element, where he acts almost as a prophet as well as a mediator. And part of a prophet was if they did not perform or did not come through with what they said, they were subject to the people to be rejected or killed. So this is this element coming in the story of Moses. But God provides for him. And he goes, he is heard, he is listened to, and then they go to Pharaoh. Pharaoh, we know the story, he rejects, he has the 9 plagues, and then the 10th one is the Passover. And this is where the angel of death comes in and kills all the firstborn. And this is where Hebrews jumps back in to say, by faith, he, Moses, kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. So this is where Moses believes in God and trusts him, and this is where this element of faith comes in, where he is saying, as he did before, I believe in you, God, and I trust in you for the outcome of this circumstance. He trusts in the invisible to provide in the visible. And this is where we see it through Moses' story, that he is obeying God. He is trusting him to provide for him in the killing to come, in this invisible act of spiritual judgment. Then we read in the next verse, by faith the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. We also see the people, by faith, trusting in God who is unseen to provide in the physical a salvation from the Egyptian army. They trust him for the impending physical judgment. So we see from Moses, by faith, he trusted God for providing from the spiritual judgment and from the physical judgment. This faith. And this is actually the end of the part of Moses' story, because the rest from now on is under covenant, under law, and not where Moses believed by faith. And actually we read in the Moses' story that he failed to live by faith in the wilderness, where he disobeyed God, and when he was told to speak to a stone, he hit a stone, and ultimately, because of this disobedience, he could no longer enter the promised land. But what we do see from this part is that when God viewed their faith, he didn't view, as we read, as they crossed the Red Sea, they believed in him. And it wasn't the evil of the Egyptians that caused them to be drowned, but it was their lack of faith. And I think that's the result for many of us, to remind us that God sees the actions, and he knows the actions, and he will hold us to account for our actions. But he acts on salvation, this element where he spiritually provides and physically provides salvation for those who believe by faith. Our actions matter, our actions are important, but they come from our faith. They stepped into the Red Sea by faith and were provided for. The Egyptians stepped into the Red Sea without faith and were drowned. It's this heart of faith which set them apart, whether they were judged positively or negatively. So we should be encouraged and reminded that, yes, our actions are important, but they follow our faith. Just as Moses, his actions weren't always great, but he had faith in those important moments, so he was provided for. And we know in Jesus we have that sacrifice, that Passover lamb, to cover our former sins, just as the Israelites had sacrifice to cover their sins. And we see that Moses' heart of the story was have faith, have relationship with God, trust in him for coming difficulties, and put your faith in him regardless of the outcome, but trust in him that he will provide for you. And I think that's the real lesson that we can learn from Moses. And I think it's best summarized actually at the end of his life, in Deuteronomy 6, the Shema, where he says to the people, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." Or it could be translated muchness. And this sums up Moses' story. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. It's this Shema, this prayer that was the last thousands of years. That's the foundation of one of the foundational prayers of Judaism. Is this idea that Moses is summarizing the law for the Israelites, and he's emphasizing faith by loving God, trust in him, love him with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Your actions flow from your heart and your soul. These are the most important parts, but it has to have them all. And there's this element of trust in God for the physical and spiritual difficulties and judgments and things to come, and put your faith in him for the outcome. And I think that we can all relate with that. We all, in this very time, have to trust God through difficult things, through many different elements. But it's how we respond. Do we respond by doing it ourselves, by trying to take the fruit, making our right choices, making ourselves God or our own systems God? Or do we come under him, choose his loyalty, choose his way, choose his kingdom? So that would be, for us, the lens of Moses, the story of Moses, in this idea of the whole story. So I hope that you enjoyed that. I really enjoyed learning and studying. There's a lot of new details that I was able to pick up. And so now we will go into a time, if you have, for your questions. Thanks for watching.